Germany did not fall in a single night. It eroded slowly, quietly, under the weight of despair and exhaustion. By the early 1930s, the promise of the Weimar Republic felt distant and fragile. The streets were restless, the factories silent, the queues for bread growing longer by the week. What had once been Europe's most ambitious democratic experiment now stood trembling, its fate uncertain, its defenders divided, and its enemies waiting patiently for the moment to strike. A moment that, unbeknownst to most Germans, was already drawing dangerously close. The shock that accelerated everything came from across the Atlantic. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 shattered the global economy, but in Germany it landed like a hammer blow. American loans were recalled overnight, banks collapsed, businesses failed. Unemployment soared past 6 million, every election promised relief. Every government delivered paralysis, coalitions formed and collapsed with dizzying speed. No party could govern, no majority could hold. And with every failure, faith in democracy drained away until millions began asking a question that would soon prove fatal. What if democracy itself was the problem? Into this vacuum stepped men who had already lost. Conservative elites, aristocrats, generals, industrialists looked back on the empire with longing and disgust at the chaos of Republican rule. Figures like Franz von Papen and Alfred Hugenberg believed the masses had to be guided, not consulted. They wanted authority without accountability, order without elections, but they lacked popular support. And so, by late 1932, they made a decision that would alter the course of history. Instead of resisting the radical right, they would use it, convinced they could control the fire without being burned. The man they chose was Adolf Hitler. To them, he was vulgar, unstable, a demagogue with street support but no discipline. Yet he commanded millions of votes and an army of loyal followers. Better, they reasoned, to bring him into government, give him a title, surround him with responsible conservatives, and let him absorb the anger of the masses while real power remained elsewhere. It was a gamble built on arrogant sand. It ignored a crucial truth that was already becoming clear behind closed doors. Hitler was not waiting to be managed. He was preparing to dominate. While conservatives schemed, Hitler courted power with calculated precision. He met privately with industrial magnates, assuring them that labor unions would be crushed and profits protected. He promised national revival, military strength, and the destruction of Marxism. His message shifted depending on the audience, but its core never changed. Chaos would end, enemies would be eliminated, and Germany would rise again. Even those who despised him began to believe they needed him, if only temporarily. And as these negotiations unfolded, one aging man held the final key. A man increasingly isolated, increasingly nostalgic, and increasingly willing to gamble with the Constitution itself. President Paul von Hindenburg, hero of the First World War, was 85 years old. He distrusted Hitler deeply, yet he distrusted democracy even more. Surrounded by advisors who promised stability, pressured by elites who warned of civil war, Hindenburg turned again to the emergency powers of Article 48, the constitutional loophole that allowed the president to rule by decree. It had been used before. This time, however, it would be handed to a man who had no intention of giving it back. And when Hindenburg finally agreed, the decision was framed as temporary, cautious, and reversible, three assumptions that would unravel with terrifying speed. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor of Germany. There were no tanks in the streets, no parliament stormed at gunpoint. Conservatives congratulated themselves on a clever maneuver. Many Germans shrugged, believing this was just another weak government that would soon fall. But behind the ceremony and the handshakes, the machinery of democracy had just been placed into hostile hands. The experiment had begun, and its outcome was already far more dangerous than anyone was willing to admit. If you're finding this story gripping so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover these hidden turning points of history, moments when everything changed long before most realized it had. Hitler entered office wearing the mask of restraint. Publicly, he spoke of unity, legality, and national healing. Photographs from the first days of his chancellorship show a man carefully performing humility, head slightly bowed, voice measured, gestures controlled. To many observers, especially abroad, he appeared boxed in by conservative ministers and constitutional limits. But behind the scenes, something far more dangerous was already unfolding, and the speed of it would soon leave Germany reeling. The first move was control of force. Within hours of taking office, Hitler demanded authority over Germany's largest state, Prussia. President Hindenburg agreed. Hermann Göring, loyal, ruthless, and ambitious, was installed as Minister of the Interior. That single appointment shifted the balance of power overnight. Göring purged the police of political opponents and replaced them with Nazi loyalists. Even more crucially, he authorized the SA and SS violent party militias as auxiliary police. Street brawlers were now officers of the law, carrying badges, batons, and legal immunity. Terror no longer lurked outside the state. It was the state. The violence was not random. It followed a calculated rhythm. Nazi stormtroopers raided union offices, Communist Party headquarters, and opposition newspapers. Arrests multiplied, often without charges. Judges looked away. Prosecutors stalled. Conservatives reassured themselves this was necessary firmness. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels, newly empowered as propaganda chief, urged patience. In his diary, he described the plan with chilling clarity. Let fear rise naturally. Let the public demand security, then strike decisively under the cover of emergency. Germany, he believed, was already primed for the moment. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on the night of February 27, 1933. Just after 9 p.m., flames erupted inside the Reichstag building, the symbolic heart of German democracy. Fire lit the sky above Berlin as crowds gathered in disbelief. Inside, police arrested a young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, wandering half-naked and incoherent among the smoke. He confessed quickly. Whether he acted alone, was manipulated, or was framed would be debated for decades. But the truth no longer mattered. Within hours, Nazi leaders declared the fireproof of a vast communist conspiracy and imminent uprising aimed at overthrowing the state. Fear spread faster than facts. Newspapers screamed of revolution. Radio broadcasts warned that Germany stood on the brink of chaos. Memories of street fighting and attempted coups from the early 1920s surged back into public consciousness. Middle-class Germans, already exhausted and frightened, demanded protection. And Hitler, who had arrived at the burning Reichstag before the flames were out, knew exactly how to respond. By dawn, he was already drafting the death warrant for civil liberty. On February 28th, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire decree. With a single signature, core articles of the Weimar Constitution were suspended: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, privacy of mail and telephone, protection from arbitrary arrest. The decree was framed as temporary and emergency response to crisis. But it contained no expiration date. Police could now detain anyone indefinitely, without trial. Political opposition was no longer protected by law. Democracy, though still formally alive, had lost its legal shield. Arrests followed immediately. Communist deputies were seized in their homes. Party offices were shut down. Printing presses were smashed. Courts accepted evidence extracted under duress. Conservative ministers, still sitting in Hitler's cabinet, assured themselves this was aimed only at extremists. They told themselves order was being restored. They did not ask what would happen once the definition of enemy began to expand, because by then, the machinery was already in motion. Within 48 hours of the fire, Germany had crossed a line from which it would never return. Emergency powers had become routine, violence had become legal, and the promise that Hitler could be controlled was already unraveling in plain sight, even as the nation prepared for one last election that would decide whether any resistance remained at all. The election campaign of 1933 did not unfold in speeches and debates. It unfolded in prisons, back alleys, and interrogation rooms. With the Reichstag Fire decree in force, the machinery of repression accelerated at a breathtaking pace. Police and auxiliary SS units swept through working-class districts before dawn, hauling away organizers, trade unionists, and local politicians. Many were never formally charged. Others disappeared into makeshift detention centers' basements, abandoned factories, stables where beatings replaced ballots, and silence was enforced with fists. Officially, Germany was still a constitutional republic preparing for a democratic vote. In reality, the opposition had been crippled. Communist newspapers were banned outright. Social democratic meetings were disrupted by uniformed men. Posters were torn down. Voters understood the message without needing it spelled out. Participation carried consequences. And yet, despite the terror, Hitler faced an uncomfortable truth. His grip on power was not yet absolute, and the coming election could still expose that weakness. March 5, 1933, arrived under an atmosphere of surveillance and intimidation. Polling stations were ringed with SA men. Voters were watched as they entered and exited. Arrests continued even as ballots were being cast. The Nazis framed the election as a referendum on security versus chaos, promising protection from an invented enemy. But when the votes were counted, the result was not the landslide Hitler had demanded. The Nazi Party emerged as the largest faction, but still fell short of an absolute majority. Even under terror, millions of Germans had refused to surrender their political will. The failure enraged Hitler, but it did not stop him. Instead, he turned to symbolism and spectacle. On March 21st, the regime staged the Day of Potsdam, a meticulously choreographed ceremony linking the Nazi movement to Germany's imperial past. Inside the garrison church, Hitler bowed deeply before President Hindenburg, presenting himself as the loyal servant of tradition and order. Cameras captured every angle. The message was unmistakable. The old elite and the new movement were now one. For conservative deputies watching closely, doubts began to dissolve. Behind the scenes, repression continued. Communist deputies, elected representatives of the German people, were arrested or driven into hiding. Their seats in parliament remained empty. The arithmetic of democracy was being quietly rewritten. Without these deputies present, Hitler no longer needed a majority of the full Reichstag, only of those still allowed to attend. What remained was to secure legal authority to rule without parliament at all, and for that, he needed one final vote. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag convened inside the Karl Opera House, its usual chamber still damaged by fire. The setting was symbolic and menacing. Armed SA and SS men lined the aisles and entrances. Their presence was deliberate, a silent reminder of what resistance now meant. Inside the hall, the absence of communist deputies was glaring. Many were already in prison, others were in hiding. Democracy was voting, but only those permitted to speak were allowed inside. The Social Democratic Party stood alone. Otto Wels, their leader, delivered a final speech defending freedom, dignity, and the rule of law. He spoke knowing it would change nothing. When the vote came, the Social Democrats voted no. Every other party under pressure, intimidation, or illusion voted yes. The Enabling Act passed, transferring legislative power entirely to Hitler and his cabinet for 4 years. The Reichstag had legally voted itself into irrelevance. With that vote, the final barrier fell. There would be no further checks, no meaningful opposition, no constitutional restraint. The dictatorship had been approved not by tanks or foreign armies, but by frightened men raising their hands in a room surrounded by armed guards. Germany's democracy had not been overthrown, it had been authorized to die. The Enabling Act did not mark the end of the transformation, it marked the beginning of its acceleration. With parliament sidelined and opposition shattered, the regime moved to ensure that no reversal was ever possible. What had been improvised terror now became structured, bureaucratic, and permanent. Within days, Emergency rule hardened into a system designed not merely to govern Germany, but to reshape it entirely. Even before the vote, detention had been normalized. Now it was formalized. On March 22, 1933, just outside Munich, the first official concentration camp opened at Dachau. It was described as a facility for protective custody, a phrase that masked its true purpose: indefinite imprisonment without trial. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists, and intellectuals were sent there by administrative order alone. No judge reviewed their cases, no sentence defined their release. The camp was presented as temporary, but like so many measures before it, it had no end date. By March 31st, a law ominously titled the Law for the Coordination of the States with the Reich dissolved Germany's federal structure. State governments were stripped of autonomy and placed under Nazi-appointed governors. Local democracy vanished almost overnight. City councils, regional parliaments, and civil administrations were purged and synchronized Gleichschaltet into obedience. Authority now flowed in one direction only, upward, toward Hitler. The legal framework of dictatorship was complete, and it had taken just 60 days. Control of information followed with equal speed. Hundreds of newspapers were banned outright, thousands more were pressured into silence. Editors who resisted were dismissed or arrested. Joseph Goebbels, now Minister of Propaganda, announced total control over press, radio, film, and culture. Art, music, and even language were brought into line. The state would not merely govern, it would narrate reality itself. Germans would hear one voice, see one vision, and absorb one version of truth. Economically, the regime wrapped itself in myths of recovery. In reality, Germany's downturn had already begun easing in late 1932. Public works programs predated Hitler's rule. But the new government claimed credit for everything, rebranding existing projects as Nazi achievements. Autobahn construction, conceived years earlier, became propaganda symbols of renewal. Behind closed doors, however, Hitler spoke not of prosperity, but of rearmament. Economic revival was never the goal, it was preparation. Internally, the regime was far from unified. Power struggles simmered between radical populists, conservative elites, and industrial backers. There was no coherent economic doctrine, only agreement on enemies and expansion. Yet these conflicts did not weaken the system. They were contained by loyalty to the leader and fear of exclusion. The dictatorship did not require efficiency, only obedience. And obedience was now enforced by law, terror, and habit. By the end of March 1933, Germany was no longer a constitutional state. Emergency had become normal. Rights existed only on paper. Opposition had been erased not by mass resistance, but by compliance, calculation, and silence. The collapse had been legal, incremental, and terrifyingly fast. Before a single battlefield victory, before a single foreign invasion, the foundations for war had already been laid carefully, deliberately, and with widespread cooperation. What followed would consume Europe and scar the world. But the moment that made it possible had already passed quietly, efficiently, and with the approval of institutions that believed they were preserving order. History would remember the tanks and the battles. Far fewer would remember how it truly began.